Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. As you can see in this background, I have made a tier list. I've been asked a numerous amount of times to make a tier list, so I decided to do just that, specifically for PvP, and I guess more specifically for Alliance Conquest. I have made a timeline tier list as well, and you can probably check that out in the documents if you want to see it ahead of time, but I likely won't cover it in this video because it might get too long, so I'll probably take a look at that in another video. Also, I'm now a star agent with Marvel Future Fight, so that means that I get some nifty little things like coupons that I'm going to be giving away. So if you want a chance at one of the 300 crystal coupons, make sure to stick around to the end of the video where I discuss how you can get those. By the way, if you want access to this tier list, all you have to do is check the description, and there should be a link there for not only this tier list, but also the timeline tier list, as well as any future game guides that I'll be including for this game. So before I cover where each character is placed on the tier list, I'm going to first go over the structure of it, so you get a better understanding of how everything is organized. At the top of the tier list, you have the legend, which are little icons and descriptions that are associated with each character that either highlight a strength or a characteristic that they have, or some other kind of interesting information that you should know about them. So the first one, the artifact required, or the black hexagon icon, means that this character almost always needs the artifact in order for them to hold their placement in the tier list where they are currently located. Helpful support means that the character has some kind of passive, either as a tier 1, tier 2, possibly even a tier 3 passive like Molecule Man, or a uniform passive that can affect the team. Good leadership is pretty straightforward, is any kind of lead skill that isn't a passive skill. That can be anything from attack increase, defense increase, ignore dodge, HP increase, or anything like that. Should be teamed basically outlines that the character performs much better when you have them on a team that is usually associated with them. So that would be things like the Black Order, Defenders, and Warriors of the Sky, being much stronger when they're together since their passives and synergies work well together, as opposed to using them apart as solo characters. Tends to survive are usually characters that are left standing in a fight, mostly because they have things in their kit that makes them survive longer than other characters. That can be things like a revive, a lot of healing, or a lot of dodge or guaranteed dodge, or anything like that. Tends to one-shot is usually characters that have a very strong single burst skill, either with a damage proc or without. Relies on reflect means that the character has reflect in their kit and oftentimes uses this to take down the opponent. Iframe ignore is pretty straightforward and is any character that is capable of ignoring the opponent's iframes. CC or lockdown is characters that have a lot of crowd control in their kit or have a lot of skills that have that super guard break penetration. This is pretty useful on a character because oftentimes it forces the opponent to use a debuff removal to deal with this. The counter icon, similar to the iframe ignore icon, means that the character has a counter skill in their kit, but doesn't necessarily mean that they have an iframe ignore counter skill. I didn't make an icon specifically for that, so oftentimes if you see something like the iframe ignore icon and the counter icon on the same character, more than likely they will have an iframe ignore counter skill. And then lastly, the debuff removal passive means that the character can cleanse themselves and usually doesn't require a debuff leadership. So that would be characters like Falcon and Captain America, amongst others. And then after the legend, you have the actual tier breakdown of the characters. And because the meta tier has many characters in them, with some performing a little bit better than others, I tried to divide that into 3 subcategories with specific criteria for each one. The highest tier is known as the top metas, and these are the characters that are the best in Alliance Conquest. You can see in brackets I put walls there because the criteria that distinguishes these characters from the others is that they are very difficult to take down. If you have one or multiple of these characters on a team, and then you have multiple of these teams in a zone, you can basically form a wall and keep the opponent from going in a specific direction on the Alliance Conquest map. So effectively, the opponent will have to take down these quote-unquote walls in order to progress into parts of the map that they want to. The next meta tier is the upper metas, and what distinguishes these characters from the wall characters is that these are solo characters. So these characters can potentially take down the wall characters by themselves, or even other characters in the meta by themselves, but they are not as defensively strong as the wall characters, meaning that they have only one part of the two parts that make up the criteria for the top metas. The lower meta characters are then one step lower, meaning that they usually don't solo by themselves or are less consistent than the solo characters, but they have the capability of taking down meta characters, including both the upper meta and the top meta characters. So again, whereas the solo characters could take down top meta characters or any other meta characters by themselves, the lower meta characters are capable of doing that as well, but they usually require help from another strong damage character or a good leadership or support. So whereas the previous three tiers or sub-tiers fell into the meta category, the next tier or the A tier is outside of the meta but is very close to it, usually because the character is either a little bit inconsistent or they're missing some very strong characteristic that can place them in the meta tier. So that would be things like reflect or iframe ignore or counter skills or other kinds of skills that are generally found in the meta tiers. The B tier then follows afterwards, though I did put it kind of separate on the list from the meta and the A tier characters, because generally if you have the meta and A tier characters, you're going to be using those instead of the B tier characters. And this is typically because these characters are lacking a number of things. It can either be something like a good uniform, a T3 or Awakening upgrade, or something as simple as even having iframes in their kit. C tier characters are then separate from B tier characters even more because these characters can't really compete with the current meta or higher level characters because they don't have any kind of upgrade. They don't have a T3 upgrade or their Awakening or Transcendence. You might have noticed that some characters in the B tier also don't have their T3 or Awakening, but they usually have some other kind of quality that makes them much stronger than the ones in the C tier. They can either have a really good uniform, or they can have a really good kind of leadership or passive skill, or even very good damage. And when I'm saying really good, I mean relative to the C tier characters. So again, just to summarize, to make the clarification a little bit easier, the B tier is usually missing one or at most two things, whereas the C tier is not only missing the upgrade to their T3 or Awakening, but also something else. And then the final tier I labeled simply as filler because these are usually the characters that you might throw on the bottom end of a typical team in order to fill out that 6 character requirement. The criteria that highlights these characters are that they're basically not really usable because they need to be reworked. They're either outdated or their kit doesn't really function that well in order to compete with the other characters on the list. There are some exceptions to this in that there are some good supports or leaderships possibly, but they're basically just that. As standalone characters, they are not good. That's why they are in this category, because the tier list is based off characters' standalone potential. And that's generally the structure of the tier list. Besides that, I've also organized every tier from top to bottom, going from combat, speed, blast, and universal, and that's depicted by the color red, which is attributed with combat, green with speed, blue with blast, and purple for universal. Then within each type of character, I've organized it from top to bottom based on the character that I think is better than the previous. So for every type, i.e. combat, for example, the characters that are at the top of that particular type organization are the ones that I think are better performing than the ones at the bottom. The types themselves being above another doesn't really show anything, it's just the way that I organize the tier list, starting with combat, and then going to speed, and then blast, and then universal. So that doesn't show anything, but the characters within each of the typings does show something. Also, you might have noticed that for the top meta tier, I don't have that particular type breakdown, but rather I just include what I think is the top character within that category down to the bottom. Now, you might disagree with the tier list that I have, and that's perfectly fine. The idea is that the tier list is supposed to give you a rough breakdown of where these characters land respective to one another. Now, I haven't organized this tier list simply based off how I feel the characters should be ranked, but rather I have tested out pretty much every single one of these characters, especially the ones in the meta A tier, B tier, and even the C tier, to see how they perform relative to one another. From those findings, I came up with the list, and then I checked in with some other friends and Alliance Conquest members in order to see if they largely agreed with the list, which seemed to be the case. So generally speaking, the way that this tier list will help you out is that it'll give you an idea of which characters to build up first, but besides that, if you're taking on characters that are on the higher end of the tier list, then you generally want to stick either to the column right beside it or one beside that in order to have the highest potential for winning a fight and taking out your opponent. So what I mean by this is that if you're taking on a character like Doom, you want to consider using characters in the upper meta tier in order to counter him, such as characters like Crescent, for example, possibly Captain Marvel, or possibly Supergiant, before you consider using characters that are further down in the tier list, like for example Corvus or Doctor Strange, or characters that follow after that. Obviously, based on this, the highest probability for you to beat Doom is to use a character within the same tier, but because the top meta tier only has a limited number of characters in it, being somewhere around 10 or 11 or so, then that's why I mentioned the adjacent tiers, which give you the next highest probability of beating that character. Now, the video would get a little bit too long if I looked at why each character belongs where they do, so I'm mostly just going to focus on the top meta tier and explain why it's ordered in the way that it is. So in the top meta category, I have Doom at the very top because he's usually very tough to take down, and he has that iframe ignore counter as well as the universal typing that makes him pretty much strong against every character in the game. I would put Wolverine at the very top, but he is arguably not as strong simply because it depends on whether you have his artifact at the highest level or not. Aside from that, because he's combat typed, he can be countered by strong blast types, and because he has lingering damage on his skills, he can also be potentially countered by reflect characters, such as possibly Colossus or Defenders, whereas Doom isn't as susceptible to reflect because he iframes so much. But regardless, the two characters are so close to one another that depending on whether you have the max level artifact for him and a really good build, he could potentially be the number one character for Alliance Conquest, since many times if you're playing in higher ranked Alliance Conquest, he is usually the toughest to take down because he'll live for 7 seconds, whereas Doom, you usually only have to take out one of his lives to basically wipe him from that team. Gilgamesh is third for similar reasons to Wolverine because his artifact really determines his spot, so he has that artifact icon as well, but he's generally very tanky and oftentimes he'll basically survive most teams, which makes him a really good wall character. Quicksilver doesn't really have the defensive or survival potential that the other three characters that I mentioned have, but his offensive potential is so high that it makes it very tough to take him down if he can kill you before you're able to do any damage to him. Aside from that, Quicksilver can basically take down any character in the game with about 1 second or so if he goes straight into his fourth skill. Because of Luke Cage's amazing survival, his leadership, and the support that he gets from the other defenders, he's typically another character that is very difficult to take down, but might not be able to take out any character in the game, similar to how Quicksilver can. Daredevil is then right beside Luke Cage, since his third counter can potentially take out any character in the game, though he typically doesn't survive as long as Luke Cage himself, because Luke Cage has that amazing healing passive. Silver Surfer is then right after, because he has that amazing passive reflect. He's a universal type, so he doesn't have a disadvantage to anyone, and he has that third skill, which has that iframe ignore counter, and can potentially one-shot any character in the game. The reason that he's ranked under Daredevil is because the AI typically uses the first and second skill, which often leaves Silver Surfer vulnerable and makes him easier to take out. Sentry then comes after Surfer because he doesn't have that passive reflect, which makes Surfer so much better, but also Sentry can potentially get stuck in a bad rotation, leaving him without using his fifth skill, which is his best one that can potentially wipe out multiple characters, if not the whole team. Shang-Chi is a very strong character, specifically because he frequently spams his third skill, which has that iframe ignore as well as the reflect. But he is at this level of the list because if the character doesn't survive long enough to go into the third skill again, his kit typically isn't strong enough to take out any possible character in the game, and heavily relies on that third skill. Mephisto is the only blast type character that is in the top meta tier, simply because the other blast type characters don't really have the tools in their kit that he does, particularly the iframe ignore. And although Mephisto's burst damage is really good and his survival is also good, his skills are generally kind of slow, which makes him susceptible to opponents being able to counter him in that sense, especially ones that have iframe ignore themselves. Makkari is the last one in this tier because although she is very good, she does lack the characteristic that all the other characters in this tier have, which is that she doesn't have an iframe ignore skill. But even though she doesn't have this skill, she does have a counter skill, and her high guaranteed dodge and dodge allow her to stay alive for the most part, especially because many of her skills are long iframe skills, and because her third skill does have that super armor, or super guard break rather, penetration. When she goes into her third skill, which is typically at the start of fights, she can basically lock down opponents, and similar to Quicksilver's fourth skill, can pretty much one-shot them because it has that accumulation on the skill itself. Also, I might have forgotten to mention another reason why the characters in the top meta list are in that list, and that's because these characters can typically take down characters that they have a type disadvantage to, or that can counter them. So what I mean by this is that typically the defenders will counter physical type characters, but Wolverine is so strong and he has that penetration and that third skill that has the iframe ignore counter and the high burst damage, that he can potentially take down the defenders, especially if he has the artifact that lets him survive, so that when he does the damage and it gets reflected back to him, he still has that 7 seconds or however long grace period to be able to take down the defenders before the reflect damage is too much and kills him. So again, these are characters that can take out their own counters or opponents that they have a type disadvantage to. Some other notable mentions to look at besides the top tier characters are the ones from the Asgard Invasion update. So as you can see, Hela is at the very top of the universal upper meta tier. She's basically a staple for some of the best characters in Alliance Conquest, such as ones with Doom and Wolverine, and I basically left her there just because I needed more testing and I need to see more opponents to be able to determine if she belongs in the top meta tier as opposed to the upper meta tier. But as it stands, she's really strong and got an amazing rework, and she can solo potential meta teams like the Defenders or the Eternals. The only thing that she's missing is that iframe ignore, but similar to Makkari, she can do a lot of things even without it, especially with her third skill even potentially being able to one-shot opponents even without a damage proc. If you have the artifact for Heimdall, he's actually really strong and very close to Hela, and surprisingly even better than some characters that have iframe ignore in their kit. His survival is really good, even if you don't have a survival based build with something like a regen or authority, because his 4th skill gives him damage immunity for up to 8 seconds when the skill activates. In addition to that, he doesn't need a debuff leadership, which means that you can fully buff him up using his own leadership or other leaderships and other supports. This usually means that his damage and survival gets boosted up so much that he can take out the majority of the characters in this game, including in some cases Doom. Thena falls a little bit further down the list because although she does have a good leadership, even though it doesn't have the debuff, and she does have really good burst potential, especially with her 5th skill and potentially even her 3rd skill, and because she goes into those skills very early on and they're long iframes, her survival is pretty decent, especially now that she got the healing on her 4th skill. But besides those things, she doesn't really have too much else going for her, which is the reason that she's in the lower portion of the meta tier. And then lastly, Sif is in the A tier. Although she does have that penetration to all sources on her passive, a lot of her skills don't have iframe ignore and are just long skill animations, which leaves her very susceptible and doesn't really give her an opportunity to be able to fight with some of the higher tier characters on this list. That pretty much wraps up the coverage of the tier list that I'm going to go into. The video would get too long if I cover every character or just discuss many of the other things, so if you have questions about why a character is at a specific spot, or you have any questions in general, then make sure to leave them in the comments section down below, or if you have additional questions and want to get feedback or other stuff from other people within the community, you can also consider joining the Discord, which you can find the link in the description. Finally, if you've stuck around this long in the video and want to know how to get the crystal coupon that I mentioned in the beginning of the video, all you have to do is like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment where I can reach you to send you the coupon code. So that could be something like your line ID, your Discord ID, or possibly your email address. Please make sure to mention that in your comment, otherwise I have no way to send you the coupon code. I'll make sure to update the tier list when the next update hits, so that'll be for Spider-Man and any of the related villains to him. But yeah, if you liked the video, please consider sharing it with your friends, since it might help them out as well. Thanks for your time and watching, but the video is now over.